Hello. We'll let the last few people roll in, and then we'll start. As you heard, my name is Godfrey. You can find me on the internet as Code. Oh, actually, sorry, one thing. I'm supposed to do a screencast. Okay. I think that worked. Yes. Okay, let's start over. Hello, my name is Godfrey. You can find me on the internet as Code. I came all the way here from a land far, far away, called the United States of America. I work for a small software company in Portland, Oregon called Tilda. We make a product called Skylight. It's a smart performance profiler for Rails apps. So if you're one of those, you might want to check us out. It's at skylight.io. I used to be on the Rails core team, and these days I work on a JavaScript framework called Ember. And when I'm not working on either of those, I spend my time producing quality internet content like these. As you can see, it works. Yeah, as you can see, I'm a few likes and retweets short of 10,000. So if you, you know what you know what to do. So please take out your phone right now. I'll wait. Seriously, go on. Don't worry. We can wait. Meanwhile, let me fix some audio setup. And there. All right. Well, thank you for like, sharing, and subscribe. No, seriously, take out your phones. Not for my Twitter, but for this. If you can go to this URL on your phone or your computer, reactions.live, that would be pretty awesome. Your feedback is super important to me, and so I built this app that lets you share your feedback with me live with emojis, just like that. All you need to do is go to this URL on your phone, put your finger in one of those emojis, hold on to it for a couple of seconds, and it will show up on my screen. You can do this throughout the talk all the way. If you find my jokes funny, you can go for the laugh emoji. And if you don't like that, that's too bad because there's no thumbs down emoji. But maybe you can try to poop. Okay. Actually, let's try to fix that screen size thing. Okay. Maybe it's better now. Yeah, there we go. Doing it properly, doing it live. Okay, so keep that going. Leave your phone out. You will have more opportunities to participate in the talk with the app later on. So it would be good if you can get it now. So. Let's talk about languages for a second. Every time I travel to a new country, I try to learn a little bit of their languages, right? And a lot of times this could be a pretty frustrating experience because a lot of times things in other languages doesn't work the way I expect, and I tend to complain about how confusing they are. But then when I think about it a little bit more, actually that's a little bit unfair because English is pretty confusing too. If you couldn't tell, I'm not a native English speaker myself. I grew up in Hong Kong, and that's where I learn my English in school. And I had a lot of trouble learning the language growing up too. And since we have a room full of non-native speakers here, maybe you understand some of my struggles. So the first thing they taught you in elementary school, like literally the first day, the first class, thank you for that poop emoji, I see what you did there. The first thing they taught you is when nature calls, you raise your hand and ask the teacher to go to the toilet. So that's what I learned, and that's what I memorized all of my life. But later, I moved to Canada, and they actually don't call it that. They call it the washroom, and I was told that it would be rude to ask for the toilet. So I was like, okay, my entire life is a lie. But then later I moved to the US and they call it something else. They call it the bathroom. It doesn't really make sense because half of the time you're talking about the room. You're not talking about the room that you take your bath or shower in, but they call it that anyway. And if you go to UK, they call it the loo. And if you're flying, they call it the lavatory. And don't even get me started on the dozens of informal names for it. So maybe you're thinking, well, that's a little bit unfair because a lot of this has to do with cultural differences, not about the language itself. And you might be right. If you think about it, there are actually a lot of very smart features in the English language. So for example, look at these sentences. I want you to look at the bolded words, right? You got that? So the cool thing is if you just add this prefix in front of all the words, you just add re in front of them. It means do that thing, whatever that thing is, do it again. So that's pretty cool, and it's a very powerful concept because you just have to learn one prefix, and suddenly you know double the amount of words. Except when you try to use that, sometimes it doesn't work. For example, if you have please sign and you try to add that prefix, that means a very different thing, probably not what you meant. Not to mention the word sign, as simple as a word like that, could have a dozen of different meanings. For example, we saw that it could mean writing a signature on a piece of paper, but it could also mean the symbols and pictures and words that's posted on the wall. If you're religious, it could mean a special message from God, or if you're superstitious, it could have something to do with the stars in the skies and the month you're born, or something like that. Or it could mean the sign language, or even aliens. So not to mention if you're writing this on paper and you write the stroke a little bit too long, it means something completely different. So that's English. And now you might still be thinking that's a little bit unfair because you rarely talk about aliens and signatures at the same time, so no one really get confused about that in practice. Well, maybe think again, because for example, if your boss come over to you and say, hey, you're doing outstanding work there, that's probably a very good thing. But on the other hand, if your boss come over and tell them you have too many outstanding PRs, that's probably not a good thing. It's the same word, literally the same word, outstanding, means two completely opposite things. Aside from these, sometimes they take two words, let's say car and pet, right? Like, so you look at this and it's like, oh, I know what a car is, I know what a pet is. And then they combine the two words together, and now it means a completely unrelated thing. My point is, can you believe it? There's actually a point to all of this. My point is, you're probably not giving yourself enough credit. English is hard, so thank you for working so hard to learn the language so we can communicate, and thank you for inviting me to your conference and listening to me speak in a foreign language, except those of you on the headset, in which case, thank you to the translator for doing this live, because I didn't send them my deck beforehand. So, anyway, speaking of languages that are incredibly confusing, let's talk about JavaScript. What, you're expecting a different one? So a couple of years ago, I saw this tweet and I thought to myself, wow, that's a really great point. When I need to drop down to Meadow, I totally reach for Node.js, and I totally think that all the time. Somebody should really do a talk on this. And then I waited, And I waited, and I waited, and no one ever did, so here we are. I'm waiting for the clap. Thank you. I worked super hard on that one, and I even need to get an extra mic just for that. You want to see that again? Yeah. Maybe one more time, one more time. Yes, thank you. All right, so I said, well, JavaScript is an incredibly confusing language. That's kind of a cheap joke, but actually, if you think about it, it actually really is pretty confusing because following the well-established tradition in the English language, they took two different words, in this case, Java and script, and you think, oh, I know Java, and I know what a scripting language is, so this is probably the scripting language version of Java, and nope, it actually has nothing to do with Java whatsoever. If you didn't know Java, you might not appreciate that as much, so let's talk about Java. Let me show you the way. So here on the left-hand side of the screen is the Hello World example in Java. So in order to run it, you first have to compile this program with the Java compiler. So you run a javac hello world.java that gives you a file called hello world.class. And now you can run it. So you do Java hello world, and it prints hello world as you would expect. I'm not trying to throw Java, by the way. This really is the minimal hello world example. And if you're thinking, wow, that's a lot of work to get to hello world, you're not wrong. So that got me thinking, because I'm pretty lazy. So why do that much work just to run hello world? Maybe, what if we just rename this file to hello.rb, and then we run it with Ruby? What do you think would happen there? Do you think it would just work? Syntax error, or is it going to give you a runtime error? Now, this is the part that you're waiting for. Please, let's see some emojis. Okay. So we're seeing a lot of angry face and poop emojis, about half and half. Everyone got your vote in? All right. We'll wait a few more seconds. Seems like you're still doing this. Now maybe you're just mad at me. Let's see. So we run this hello world ruby hello.rb, and turns out we have a syntax error. Congratulations to half of the room that voted for a syntax error. But what does that actually mean? So in order to understand that, we have to dig a little bit into how the Ruby interpreter works. If you're like me, you're probably treating the Ruby interpreter as a black box most of the time, or in this case, a red box. But it's actually not that scary. And if you watched Aaron's keynote this morning, he already did some of the work for me. You can think about the Ruby interpreter as executing your code in 3 different phases. First, it will take your Ruby file, it would have to parse it, and then it will compile it, and then it will execute your program. So the part where the parser is the part that gives you the syntax errors. And the last step on the right is the execute phase, and that's the part where you might get runtime errors. Now, for the most part, for the purpose of this talk, you can kind of ignore the compile phase, other than to note that the reason we don't have to run 2 programs like we did in Java is just that Ruby internally is doing the compilation for you when you run Ruby like the executable. So it's still doing the same work. It's just that Ruby has a nicely packaged interpreter that does all the work in one step. So a way to understand this is to think about the analogy in in English or in natural languages. So for example, this looks complicated, but all I'm trying to say here is the sentence, I don't speak Russian, you can see it, you can understand it. That's because it is it's a well-formed sentence that is semantically meaningful. All that is to say that this sentence is both grammatically correct and also it has a meaning that makes sense to you and me. Now, if you rearrange the words a little bit, let's say, don't Russian, I speak. Now, that is not a grammatically correct sentence in English. You cannot even begin to parse it. You cannot possibly understand this. This cannot possibly have any meanings. And that's kind of similar to how Ruby parses your program. It's basically looking at your code and according to some set of grammar rules, it tries to make sense of your program. And if it doesn't match those rules, you'll get a syntax error. And finally, if you rearrange the words again, you have Russian doesn't speak me. And in this case, it actually has the same grammatical structure as I don't speak Russian. It's actually exactly the same composition, a noun phrase followed by a verb phrase, which there are more branches down there. But this is actually a grammatically correct sentence. It just doesn't mean anything because the subject here, Russian, is not capable of speaking anything, and me is not a thing that's capable of being spoken of in that sense. So here we have a grammatically correct sentence, but it doesn't mean anything because the semantics are wrong. And that's kind of similar to how you might, even though your program doesn't have any syntax error, you might still get runtime errors at runtime because, for example, you try to call a function on nil, and nil is not a thing that can have function calls like that. So to recap, parse, compile, execute. If your program is completely wrong, it's not even Ruby, you get a syntax error. On the other hand, if it is valid Ruby but have bugs, then you might get runtime errors. So now looking at this again, we can understand why Ruby is giving us a syntax error because we're giving it a Java program, not a Ruby program, and the Java program doesn't match the grammatical rules and the Ruby parser. So this is why you're getting that error. So enough about Java. Let's talk about JavaScript. Unlike Java, this is all you have to write in JavaScript to get to hello world. You can execute this by running node hello.js, and you get hello world in the console as you would expect. So that's pretty nice. Probably not as nice as Ruby, but that's much better in Java, and you can see it looks nothing like Java at all. So now it is only logical to ask, what if we rename this file and call it hello.rb and try to run it with Ruby? What do you think would happen there? Do you think it would, A, just work, B, give you a syntax error, or do you think C will get a runtime error? Now, if you're just joining us, get your phone because you're going to go to reactions.live and you can join them in sending those poop emojis and angry faces. Okay, I think we're seeing 6-4 split, maybe 7-3 split here between the poop faces and angry faces. Maybe it's just one guy voting a lot of times. Anyway, you know what you voted for, let's see it. So if we run ruby hello.rb, turns out a lot of you are right. We're getting a name error, which is a kind of runtime error. So kudos to whoever got that right. So what's going on here? Let's look at the code. So this is JavaScript. This is not Ruby. And as we said, if you feed the wrong language into Ruby, you get a parse error. So why are we not getting a syntax error here? If you look at it, if you try to think like the Ruby interpreter, you see that what is actually happening is that the parser is thinking that, oh, you have a local variable or maybe a method called console, and you're calling the instance method .log on it, and parentheses are optional in Ruby, but it's nice that you have them in there. That helps us a little bit, actually. And you're just calling the log method with this argument. In this case, it is a string literal hello world. And finally, you have the optional semicolon too. So that's where we're at. So even though this is a JavaScript program, it turns out we have identified a program that is simultaneously valid, a valid JavaScript program and a valid Ruby program. And that's the hello world example, and Node.js is one such program. So that's great. But then we still have this error. Even though we're not getting a syntax error, we're still getting a runtime error. But that's good, because when you get a syntax error, there's literally nothing you can do. You just have to fix your code. But in this case, we're getting a runtime error, so we can actually fix that at runtime. And so this is what I came up with. So I defined a class called console with an instance method log, and that just called puts, right? Because that's how you print things into send it out in Ruby. And I assigned that to a local variable called console. And now if you try to run this program again, if you do Ruby hello.rb, you see that it prints hello world. It's fine, it works. So there we have it. Success. We have successfully executed JavaScript and Ruby, and so that's pretty great. But there's something not super nice about this. First of all, this is a lot of code to type every time you want to run JavaScript and Ruby. It would be nice if you can just abstract that a little bit and just wrap that inside a JavaScript block and have the block set up everything you need to make it work. So how do we do that? Well, it turns out what we're trying to do here is just to implement a domain-specific language where the syntax of said domain-specific language happens to look like JavaScript. So let's do it. We can do some error-driven development here. First, I did the simplest possible thing. I just defined a JavaScript method that yields to the block. So let's run it and see what happens. So here, we're getting the same error, undefined local variable method console, which is kind of what we expect because we didn't define it. So let's define that. So I basically brought back the console class, and I defined a method called console. So now, when you run that program, it works. So there's only one problem here. The problem is that the whole point of putting the code in the JavaScript block is that hopefully, outside of the block, you're still in Ruby land. And the problem is that if I write console.log outside of the JavaScript block, and I run it, it actually works. And this is not what we wanted, because we don't want to pollute the Ruby with JavaScript. We want the JavaScript to stay inside the JavaScript block. So what can we do here? Let's peel things back a little bit and look at the bare bone example again. So here we're seeing an undefined local variable method console. That's the part that we've been focusing on so far. But if you read a little bit to the right of that, you will see that it's saying this method is not defined on the main object. As it turns out, by default, Ruby will execute your code in a special top-level main object. And this object happens to be an instance of object, the class in Ruby. This is a little bit confusing, but there's the class object in Ruby, and main is an instance of objects. So what's happening is because self is implicit in Ruby, if we actually just add it to the code, it would be a little bit more clear. So really what's happening here is that self is the instance, an instance of object, the main top-level object in this case. And so what it's trying to do is trying to call a method called console on the main object, and it would basically go to the object class to look for an instance method called console. So the way we can fix this problem is basically we want to change what self is inside the block so that it is not looking for that method on the object class anymore, because we don't want to pollute the global object with the console method. So this is what I came up with. I made a new class called JavaScript, which has an instance method called console, and that returns a new instance of console. That's all stuff that we've seen before, but the main trick here is there is this method called instance exec in Ruby that basically allows you to change what self is in a given context. And that's basically how a lot of the DSLs in Ruby, for example, the Rails router and RSpec and all of that, that's how they work. So now if you run the program again, you get the expected result. The first time you call it here, because self is an instance of JavaScript, not object anymore, self.console actually exists and it does the right thing. And the second time you call it, it's back to the main top-level object, and because the object class doesn't have an instance method called console, that raises a no method error as expected. So that's great. Now if we just remove the extra line there, our program runs fine again, and we have implemented JavaScript support in Ruby. Success. Okay, so my speaker notes is getting a little bit out of sync here, so let's try to fix that. Cool. Technology, I think it's fixed. Well, the only problem is I lost the clock, so like we're probably just gonna go over time. Okay, so variables. So a programming language is not very useful if you don't have variables, right? So let's implement variables. So this is how you declare variables in JavaScript, right? Like you say, let message equals hello world. And basically, I just did a little bit of refactoring here to pull the string literal out to a variable and then pass that variable into the console function. So get your phone ready. What do you think would happen? Do you think it would just work? Syntax error. And this time we're actually going to be a little bit more precise here. I have two options here for you. No method error and name error are different specific kinds of runtime errors, but they're now we're just getting to the next level. So get your phones and let's see some emojis. Wow, we have a very divided room here. Okay, so it seems like we are split between no method error and syntax error. Let's see. Aha, half of you are right. Turns out in this case, we have an undefined method let. So what's happening? Let's see the code. This is what we wrote. Again, we know that parentheses are optional in Ruby, but if you add them, it will make it easier to see what's going on. So let's do that. So it turns out what we're doing here is we're calling the method named let. It's not a special keyword or anything in Ruby. It's just a method that happens to be called let. And then we're passing this as an argument. But what is this? Turns out this is called an assignment expression. And it's basically creates a variable binding called message and assign it to hello world. But then in Ruby, assignment expressions actually have a evaluation result, and it evaluates to the value being assigned to. So in this case, it will be hello world literal. So if you will, we can actually rearrange the code into this, and it's basically doing the same thing. First, we're defining a variable called hello world, and then we're passing in the value, which you can further rewrite into this. And so that's our code. And now looking at it this way, you can kind of see where the problem is. We don't have a method called let. So when we run this code, Ruby is complaining that we're missing a method called let. So let's fix that. So this is what I did. I basically defined a method let on our JavaScript class. The problem is, what arguments should it take and what should it do? Now, if you look at this again, you will see that it turns out all we're trying to do here is to create a variable called message, and the first line already did that for us. So the second line doesn't really matter. We don't really care what it does at all. As long as it doesn't error, as long as the let method exists, we're all good. So that's what I did. Basically, we made the let method take any arguments because we don't care, and it doesn't do anything. And now, if you run hello.rb, it works. We have leveled up our JavaScript interpreter here. Success. But wait a second. We might have celebrated a little bit too early, because in JavaScript, there's actually a second way to declare variables. You can actually declare variables without assigning a value, and then later on, you can assign whatever value you want. So you can see line 1, we have let message, and then line 2, we're actually assigning a value separately. So get your phones ready. What do you think will happen? Do you think it would just work? It would get the syntax error, or do you think it's going to be a no method error or a name error? Let's do this. Wow, for once we have someone voting for it works. Okay, we are pretty divided between all three options other than syntax errors. Let's see. So let's run this. Aha. This time we're actually getting a, whoops, no method error. So what's up with that? We have an undefined method message for our JavaScript class. What's going on? Well, if you look at the code, you can sort of see the problem. On line 2, so first we'll add the optional parentheses as we have been doing to help us out a little bit. But the problem is basically here. We define a local variable called message here, but in Ruby, you cannot reference a variable until you have declared it, and you declare it by assigning a value to it. So on line 1 here, message is actually not a local variable. So what could it be? As you have seen in the error message, if it's not a method, if it's not a local variable, then it must be a method. So what's going on here is actually that we're first calling the message method, and then we're passing the result of that to let, and then we carry on. However, because message doesn't exist, we are getting a no method error. So let's just fix that. Again, we have defined a message method, and it does nothing. Now, if you run it, it works. There's only one problem. This is kind of cheating a little bit, because if you name your variables anything else, and the point of variables is that you can name it anything, if you do that, then the code is not going to work. So don't worry, though. In Ruby, there is this very handy method called method missing. If you didn't know, it basically will call method missing every time you try to call a method that doesn't exist, and you can dynamically decide to do whatever you want here. And in this case, we literally don't care. So if you run Ruby hello.rb, the first, like on the first line when you call message, instead of triggering the no method error, it's going to call method missing. And in this case, you decide to not care, so it's not going to raise an exception. And therefore, our program works. So success. So let's talk about functions, because programming is all about functions, abstractions, and all of that. So here we have a function. We have defined a function called hello, and we basically refactor our code to move the console log into the function hello. And later on line 5, we're calling the function that we just defined. So get your phones ready. What do you think would happen? Do you think it will work? Syntax error, no method error, or name error? Let's see some emojis. We're literally all over the map. We have everything on the screen. All right, you're right. It's actually a trick question. Let's see. When you run this, what happens is nothing. It literally didn't do anything. It didn't error, it didn't complain. What is going on? Well, let's look at the code. Again, we'll add the optional parentheses and semicolon. So what we're doing here is first, we're calling the method function with this argument. But what is this? Well, here we know that this is a function method called to hello. But what is this thing next to it? Well, it turns out in Ruby, you can pass block arguments to methods. So this is basically a method called hello with no positional arguments, but with the block argument console.log hello world. So finally, after all of that, we're calling the method hello. However, something fishy is going on, because clearly we have 3 undefined methods here. Why are we not getting any errors? Turns out our old friend method missing is trolling us here. So to fix that, I have this is what I came up with. So it turns out we don't really need the function method to do anything. We just need it to exist. But when it calls method missing, the first time it called method missing with hello and the block, we can tell that we're defining a function because there's a block. Usually there's not a block, right? So if we see that we have a block, we can just define a singleton method called hello, which is given to us in the first argument of method missing. So the first time we called hello on line 1, we'll define a Ruby method called hello with the block that you gave us. And so on line 5, when you call it the second time, is actually calling the Ruby method hello, the Ruby singleton method hello, and so everything works just fine. Success. Okay, finally, let's talk about arguments, because functions are not very useful without arguments. So this is what it did. I refactored the code so that hello now takes an argument, and it uses that in the console.log with string interpolations and stuff. So let's run it and see what happens. Get your phones. Running out of time, so I'm just going to give you 5 seconds. Okay, we have 1 volt, 2 volts, and 3 volts. Whoops, forgot that. So if you're just joining us, you can still go to this website and vote. Well, it turns out I have a very limited time. I ran out of time, and I don't think I will be able to give you the answer here. But I can give you some spoiler. It is definitely possible to make this work, but I will leave that as an exercise to the reader because we ran out of time. However, if you're impatient and you just want to start using this today, I have good news for you, because you can just run gem install.javascript on your computer, and I did all the hard work for you. You can find the source code and Chenkin code /JavaScript on GitHub. We even have unit tests to make sure we don't have any regressions, and it has a lot more features than what we can cover on the slides here. So totally works. You should totally use it. But at this point, you probably have one burning question in your head. You pro You're probably wondering why. So of course I can tell you. Well, you can totally use this with Rails. As I said, we have tests. So this totally works. You can write your active record callbacks in JavaScript syntax instead of Ruby. But who am I kidding? Obviously, no one actually will try to use this in production. So why did I do it? Well, let me tell you a quick story with the 30 seconds that I have left. Before the conference, they did an interview with me, and one of the things that they asked, like everyone asks that these days, and the question was, people say Ruby is dying, and what do you think? And I gave the usual standard answer of like, I think Ruby is not dying, it's just maturing, which is totally true. I totally believe that we're just maturing. That's all great and good. But like, to be honest, there is a part of the Ruby community that kind of like maybe not dying, but I do kind of miss it a little bit. In the early days of Ruby, I personally got in around 2016 or so. A lot of us are really just there because we discovered this new fun and cool programming language that allow us to do a lot of crazy things that are not possible in other languages. Try to do this talk in any other language, I dare you. A lot of us are not even doing Ruby at work. Like, we're just trying to we just discovered this cool new toy, and we're just trying to discover together what you can do with it and what to do with it. And over time, as the Ruby community has matured, we have jobs now, we have responsibilities, we have matured, we need to care about performance and correctness and all of that. But at the same time, we kind of lost that, a little bit of that excitement, a lot of experimentation that happened when like, for example, Y was around, when we used to have Rails release notes with heart emojis in there. That kind of was in the past, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think it's just up to you and me. I think Aaron told me this earlier. I think it's not necessarily that that part of the community has died. It's just that we have attracted a lot more people in the community now. As DHH was said, it's a much bigger tent now, and a lot of us are here because we got our first job, and Ruby is the thing we use at work, so that's why we're here. But maybe it doesn't have to be serious all the time. Maybe it's good to have fun sometimes, and I hope to inspire you to maybe on your way back, on your flight, or on your train ride home, you can take out your computer and just hack on something fun. And instead of asking why, we can ask more of why not. So that's my talk. That's me on the internet. Thank you very much.
Hi, Godfrey. Thank you for your talk, and actually thank you for speaking with me on Skype. And I'm glad that it maybe inspired you a bit for a talk with my question. And actually, just maybe silly question, but do you think that there is a little misconception of defining the let function in the code? Because what the let should actually do is to initialize a new variable with empty value, but in your example it just does nothing.
Yes. First of all, you should come to TC39. Second of all, yes, I think there are some edge cases. The version on GitHub actually does a lot more things and a lot more carefully, but they're totally bugs. If you can figure out what it is and you can submit a failing test, I'll fix it, or you can figure out how to fix it. But you're totally right.
Thank you.
I think we might be out of time, but I will be around. So if you want to hack on the JavaScript gem together, if you have other questions, just come find me. Oh, I have a very important question for all of you. Actually, I would like to know what is the feature, like if you can pick one feature for Ruby 3.0 that you really want, what would that be? So think about it. Don't talk to your friends about it. Come to me. Tell me your answer. I need to collect 100 responses before we wrap up. So help me out. Thank you.
Thank you very much.